Hi everyone, it's me, Donald Robertson, here once again in Athens and broadcasting for week 4, for the webinar for week 4 in Marcus Aurelius, Life and Stoicism. So just getting set up on my desktop there. So this is a recording, making it just before we're due to go live and going to upload it. Hopefully we'll get it uploaded around about the right time, so apologies for the kind of technical issues, but on a Sunday it's quite difficult to get decent internet access in Greece, unfortunately, so we have to kind of work around that a little bit, but hopefully it doesn't make too much difference. Might even be like some advantages to doing it this way. So please introduce yourself in the comments section that will be beneath the YouTube video when it goes out. And so let's get straight into the agenda for today. We're going to, having done the introductions, do a little bit of housekeeping. Then, as always, the discussions from the previous week, from week 3, and then a preview of week 4, and then comments and questions underneath, which I'll come back and I'll check later. And apologies also if I've missed any from previous weeks. I'll go back and check those as well. And news. Actually, I'll tell you what I'm going to do after this video as well, is I'll post an Ask Me Anything about Marcus Aurelius in the Facebook group that we use. I usually do that, and I guess what it says, because I did a big one recently on Reddit that got like over 100 questions or something in it. But I'll do another one actually on Facebook if people are interested. And I'll leave that up for a day or whatever, and you can just ask me any kind of remaining questions that you have about Marcus Aurelius, his life and philosophy, which I probably know too much about at this moment in time. I have to keep getting it fresh, though otherwise you kind of forget some of the names and dates after a while a little bit. So other news, I won't bore you too much with this, but my book came out recently, my latest book number 6 actually, and it's doing very well, so we're very pleased. I know it's doing well because my editor phoned me at 4 o'clock in the morning, so that's a good sign, although I don't think he realised, I think he forgot about the time difference. But I was quite pleased to get his call, because he was telling me we've got a review of the book in the Wall Street Journal, which is quite a big deal for the publisher anyway, and it's good for Stoicism, like it's some publicity. What I really notice about that is that I hope it's not so much an ego trip for me, is more like I just kind of think, oh cool, if I look on Twitter I can see there's lots of people that read the Wall Street Journal and are businessmen and stuff like that are tweeting about it and saying, this Stoicism thing looks interesting, maybe I should learn more about it. So, hopefully reaching a new audience, right, a wider audience, trying to get outside the kind of core audience for these things. So maybe getting some more people into Stoicism, which is always good. So we're in the Wall Street Journal, trying to get an article in the New York Times at the moment. I've just finished writing an article about Stoicism and alcoholism that talks a little bit about Lucius Verus, actually, so that might be of some interest. I don't know if I mentioned this before, but I haven't told a lot of people about this. Shh, it's a secret. But the book actually is nominated for 2 Canadian literary awards. So I don't think there's much chance I'll win them, but it's good that it was nominated for them. And as a result of all the publicity that I have to do, I've been working pretty hard. There are a lot of articles, so many podcasts and interviews and articles that I can't remember them all. And so at some point I'll need to do a roundup of them and post an article that lets people know where they all are. But some of you folks have even noticed some that are relevant to this course that I'd kind of half forgotten about. Or they got lost in the mix a little bit. For example, there's one about pain, which is very relevant to the week 3 content. And there's also the article I'm most pleased about is the one that went up on Classical Wisdom Weekly website, which reaches a big audience of people that are into the classics. And I did it kind of in collaboration really with the staff at the Carnuntum Archaeological Park, as it's known. So it's not just a museum, it's bigger than that. It's 3 museums and this whole area that covers the town and the military camp beside it. There is an entire reconstructed part of the town, and 2 amphitheatres and 2 gladiatorial schools. Not like it's bigger than just a museum, it's a whole archaeological park, as they refer to it. So those videos, and I shot some footage there that are also relevant to this week's content, week 4 content. So I'll try and sort through all of that, and I'll probably send you an email after the course is finished, and because I don't also want to just overwhelm you with too much content, yet more like heaps of content. But there's other stuff that I could be sending you, and actually the article about Conundrum's not too difficult to read, and there's a bunch of photographs in it and stuff like that, so I think it might be interesting. It kind of brings the story of Marcus Aurelius a little bit more to life, I hope. So that's a little update on some news. Let's get into the content. Before we do that, just want to do a quick technical thing and check that we're definitely recording okay. Cool, I think we are good. Okay, let's go on with the feedback, the comments from week 3. So the first excerpt is about Apollonius of Chalcedon and Claudius Maximus. And so these guys are both Stoic tutors, although we can kind of infer they're certainly different figures. Apollonius seems to be perhaps even the most, maybe this is speculating a bit, but he's clearly an eminent Stoic professor, like a lecturer, and he is probably, we can maybe guess that he's probably the preeminent Stoic teacher of his time, given his role in teaching Marcus and some other like details about him. So he's kind of more of a lecturer, whereas Claudius Maximus is a highly accomplished Roman statesman and military commander, like a general, who had a storied career. And we don't know that much more about him. He is mentioned in one other place in a book called The Golden Ass. He gets a kind of passing mention. So from that we can kind of maybe infer that he was a fairly highly regarded and well-known Roman statesman. He seems to have been a kind of family friend or a personal friend of Marcus. So he's described as one of Marcus's Stoic teachers, but I'm guessing that the difference here is that he probably didn't conduct lectures, but was maybe more like a kind of personal tutor or mentor to Marcus. I mean, you get the impression that he's really much more of a role model. Marcus kind of talks about Apollonius's and some of his other teachers' kind of teaching style, the way they interact with students. He seems to be alluding to a bit, whereas some of these other figures like Claudius Maximus, it seems more like a personal relationship. He's like a personal role model to Marcus. And he was an older man, and we don't know, he obviously died at some point kind of relatively early in the story anyway. Probably died before Marcus became emperor. He kind of disappears from the history books at some point, and Marcus seems to be referring to his death in the Meditations, if I remember rightly. Does he explicitly mention his death? He talks about a serious illness or something, doesn't he? I think it seems clear that Claudius Maximus has died by the time he's written the Meditations, and he probably died before he became emperor. I think the last we hear of him is 158 AD. Sorry, I'm getting a bit lost in the weeds there, but anyway. So these are two kind of different, but both very interesting role models, and they both talk about, Marcus refers in both cases to their ability to cope stoically with pain and illness. So Michael says that he's got pain in his feet at the moment. He's been looking for the positives in all of nature. I see that as a kind of interesting technique. It's kind of like a broad. There's two ways of doing all of these techniques. This is a real hang-up in modern therapy, but there's a reason for it. It's a tricky thing to explain, but it's therefore kind of important. Anything that we do that constitutes almost any coping strategy can be abused as a form of avoidance. And therapists wrestle with this all the time with their clients. So kind of focusing on the positive aspects of nature could just be a way of avoiding thinking about the negative stuff. And you'll see clients in therapy doing stuff like that all the time. Clients that come to therapy seem like they're almost adept at taking self-help books and therapy techniques and distorting them into something that's actually counterproductive in many cases. And that's part of the kind of like the anxious or the depressed mindset, is it's kind of like, it manages to mangle even in self-help techniques unintentionally. So we have to be a little bit careful, but if we're focusing on the positive side of nature as well as the acknowledging the negative, then it's a whole different ballgame, because it potentially becomes a very healthy, kind of more expansive, more positive thing. And John actually added something, I think maybe a little bit more bringing that out, where he talks about embracing the negative while also simultaneously seeking the positive. And I think that's overall like a good way of conceptualizing Stoicism and what would be a healthy therapeutic outcome. Ignat asks whether Marcus considered bad behaviour to avoid. Yeah, he did, because in book 1 he doesn't really mention that at all, I don't think, or not very much anyway, maybe not at all in book 1. But in the rest of the Meditations he talks about people's bad characters and how he can he should try and understand what their goal is, try and understand the behaviour in context, put himself in their shoes, and then he wouldn't really be as bothered by the behaviour if he understood it in this more rounded and penetrating manner. So we should understand bad behaviour in order to move beyond it, to be better than it, to rise above it. There's this weird passage where he mentions Lucius Verus. I would describe it as almost a footnote. Like, he doesn't have his own passage despite being co-emperor and his adoptive brother. So I feel like he's really damning him with faint praise. And he says something artfully vague about how his brother's example stimulated or motivated him to improve his own character. Well, like, his brother's good example or his brother's bad example motivated him to improve? Was he thinking, I want to be just like Lucius? Or perhaps more likely, was he thinking, geez, I hope I don't turn out like that guy? I'm determined to be the opposite of him. So he phrases it somewhat tactfully, which Marcus was actually adept at doing. But it's not really clear whether he's talking about what's good or bad in Lucius. So maybe there he's talking about bad things in other people's characters. Later in meditation he talks about this a lot more though, about people in general and their bad character and bad behaviour and how we can learn from it and understand it, and thereby liberate ourselves from it. And also, I think as Ignat mentioned, that is Marcus kind of like saying that we have to keep these role models fresh in our minds, because when they're present, we, it's one thing, but then we lose contact with people, or we forget about them over the years. And I really think that's, in a way, to me, I feel like that's one of the overarching themes of the Meditations. I think maybe that's even why he wrote it. At the time that he wrote this, and during the first Marcomannic War, he's kind of away from home, probably for the first time, and several of his friends have died. And I think Marcus probably felt really lonely and isolated at the time that he began writing the Meditations, and he kind of needed to do this as a way of remembering his friends and family and what he cherished about them and what he could learn from their examples. And I think he even alludes perhaps to this idea that we have to keep these role models fresh in our mind. And he doesn't say this actually, but I would bet that, different time, different place, no social media and stuff, I would bet that Marcus kept copies of letters from his friends and family, particularly people like Junius Rusticus, his kind of like most beloved tutor, and that he probably went back occasionally and read old letters from them to kind of keep things fresh in his mind, I'm guessing. John said some stuff about this contrast between, I think he was talking about the rhetoricians or sophists and the philosophers. I don't want to kind of push that too far. Like sometimes you make an analogy when you're writing about stuff and you kind of think, all right, we're dealing with ancient history, and I'll come back to this later. There's nothing is certain. Sometimes we find out things appear one way from the surviving texts, and then we discover it's not quite right or it's contradicted by something else. But nevertheless, we shouldn't let that get in the way of a good story, to be honest. If we have to kind of pick over every detail, then we lose sight of the bigger picture and the story that's kind of presented to us. But we do have to have this caveat always that we can't really be 100% sure about the historical accuracy. We're getting biased perceptions, we're getting sometimes ambiguous accounts, sometimes contradictory accounts. So I don't want to push this too far, but having said that, with that caveat in mind, I do really think that when we read what Marcus says about Antoninus and how awesome he was and all his multitude of virtues, that many of them appear like implicit criticisms of Hadrian. And it's striking that Hadrian isn't mentioned as a role model, although he is mentioned later in the Meditations, kind of in passing. The fact that he's dead is kind of reflected on, so he's there in Marcus's mind, but he just doesn't have anything positive to say about the guy. Likewise, to some in a more complex way, actually, the main rhetoric tutors or sophists or whatever you want to call them, Herodes Atticus and Fronto. So Herodes Atticus taught Marcus Greek rhetoric. He taught him to be an accomplished writer and like of letters and speeches in Greek, and taught him Greek culture in general. It kind of would have gone beyond that. Like what sophists taught was sophistication. They taught people to be cultured. They taught them to read poetry and what would have to them have been classics as well. So they gave someone a rounded kind of like education, and but it was centered on the ability to write speeches and letters, which is obviously really important to Marcus's role as emperor. And Fronto, Marcus Cornelius Fronto, taught Marcus Aurelius Latin rhetoric, and we have a cache of letters between them, as you've probably noticed by now, which is really kind of revealing of the nature of their relationship. So Herodes Atticus, by some accounts, was just a dreadful individual who kicked his young wife to death while she was pregnant. Yeah, that's pretty bad. Like, there's no coming back from that one. Like, allegedly, I mean, actually, he was acquitted of that, but the kind of like the histories imply that he was known to be guilty. And there's at least one story, maybe a couple of, well, I guess there's a couple of stories about him having this, fierce, violent temper. And he was always having these legal wrangles with the Athenians. Like he was based in Athens. So he was kind of an unpopular, controversial, bad-tempered billionaire philanthropist. And here in Athens, we still have the Odeon, the theatre of Herodes Atticus on the side of the Acropolis. And so he was responsible for these huge public buildings, and but people had a lot of issues with the guy. But maybe he wasn't all bad, because he seemed to have dedicated his life to doing things for the arts. Although maybe that was just to kind of earn a reputation. That's what's difficult to evaluate from a distance. I think it's Seneca who says, but I don't know if Marcus says this. He kind of maybe implies it. Seneca says more explicitly that anger, in a sense, is worse in the powerful, or more dangerous in the powerful. Like, it's just as bad in the weak, but we don't see how much anger and hatred people have, because they're usually impotent to do anything with it. Whereas people like Hadrian and Herodes Atticus, guys in the bar might kind of fantasize or shoot their mouths off about hiring a hitman to bump off their ex-wife or something. Herodes Atticus or Hadrian could just click their fingers and it would be done. So with them, it's kind of like you see the unconscious kind of splayed out or something. You see, what other people are kind of like thinking in the dark recesses of their mind. These guys could just do, and there was nothing to stop them. And so sometimes they did just horrendous things. A true character emerges when they've got all this power and wealth at their disposal, perhaps. So then to kind of bring it back around to pain, which is the topic of week 3, I think John touched on this as well, that one of the simplest themes that emerges from the Stoic literature is that guys like Claudius Maximus and Apollonius of Chalcedon didn't whine or whinge or complain excessively about things. And, we have to be careful about this, because being Stoic wouldn't mean not complaining and then getting really sick and not going to the doctor and dying. I'm not kind of telling anyone about the fact that you've got a problem. It would mean just not going on about it excessively. Stoics go to the doctor. Stoics tell people that if they're genuinely having health problems, but they don't morbidly ruminate or morbidly complain about things. It's like anything, the easiest distinction we can make in life as human beings and conceptually is just between a good version and a bad version of anything, and often that oversimplifies things, but often it's helpful. We're talking about the bad sort of complaining, not the good sort of complaining. You can say there's a good sort of complaining where you just go and tell people, listen, I've got a problem and I need help with it, and there's a reason for doing that, and it'd be constructive. So I emphasise that because there's a body of research in health research on a personality trait called, or coping style called Stoicism with a small s, which is known to be harmful. And lowercase Stoicism kind of involves suppressing or denying or concealing emotions, and typically someone who's ill, often these studies are done on the elderly, who's being stoical about it, just wouldn't maybe tell the doctor, or wouldn't seek help from other people when they need it, and that is not what the Stoics are recommending that we do. They're just saying that we shouldn't morbidly ruminate about things and complain excessively about them. And also, I just as an aside, this is kind of bugging me a bit, so I just posted it. I don't know what to do with it. This phrase, orthos me, or me, orthos me, orthomunos, means, it's a really simple construction in Greek, and it just means, but it's hard to translate into English. It just means right, or upright, or correct, or on the right path, and then not having to, it's the passive form, having of the infinitive, having to be set upright by another person. So Marcus uses this little phrase to describe Claudius Maximus, that he's someone who is correct, on the right path, and morally upright, and he doesn't depend on other people to correct him or set him on the straight and narrow. Marcus uses that phrase 3 times in the Meditations, so it's clearly kind of resonates with him. And he also mentions Claudius Maximus's illness and perhaps his death about 3 times in the Meditations and other passages. And so I kind of wonder, if we really read between the lines, whether this guy's death really had an impact on him and the way he coped with it, and this aspect of his character really stuck with Marcus. Maybe this is even a phrase that Claudius Maximus used, or that someone else used to describe him. And the other there's a passage where Marcus just uses that phrase on its own, so that doesn't tell us much. And then there's another one where he uses it in conjunction with a load of other Stoic kind of traits. And so I think it's interesting to take that passage and put it next to the one about Claudius Maximus, and just kind of wonder, we'll never know for sure, but in that other passage, could he be thinking about Maximus again? Is that who he has in mind when he's describing these other qualities? Because he uses the same slightly odd turn of phrase. Anyway, I posted it in that comment section just so you can kind of compare for yourself. And I should say, it's one of these things we'll never know the answer to that, but I think nevertheless it's kind of fun and it's sort of interesting just to compare the passages and think, yeah, maybe he's still kind of thinking about this guy that seems to have had a big impact on him. Okay, strategies for coping with pain and illness. I guess the main overarching thing I should say about this is we have this free mini course called a crash course. Oh, we've got some music in the background. I don't know if the mic will pick that up. Occasionally I get some Greek folk music from the neighbours here. We have this crash course which I'm going to use for research, but it's kind of been sitting around for a while, because I've been a bit busy. Since we beta tested it, about 300 or 400 people did it. I think it's 400, and we've gathered a lot of feedback from those people. I'll come back to the importance of that in a moment. But in terms of learning pain management strategies, if you want to go further into it, you can go and do that course, and it just focuses entirely on Stoic pain management and just on the practical side of actually doing it, because we wanted to simplify it so we could give it to people who are completely new to the subject and that they could actually start applying it. Which segues nicely into the first comment, which is from Ignat, who liked the recording but recognises that it takes practice. And so to practice you need motivation. To have motivation you need kind of reassurance. You need confidence, and that comes often from peer modelling, from other people. So when people that suffer from pain see or hear other people benefiting from coping strategies, that's the most powerful thing, because then they'll be motivated to have a go at doing it themselves. And so I think, that's why the crash course is useful. You can see the comments and feedback from other people there. And also you can see maybe that I've posted the feedback forms. We got really, really positive feedback from people in the structured feedback forms that we gathered. So it's only a beta test, but we know from those people that filled out the forms that they definitely felt confident that they were gaining benefit and that they were able to apply the techniques. And so knowing that, I think, gives people more reassurance and more motivation to think maybe it's worth persevering with this myself. Ignat says most helpful thing was recognising that pain itself is not harmful. That's a really good way of putting it, actually. That is essentially the Stoics are saying pain itself isn't harmful. Like, it might be a sign of some physical injury which harms the body, but it doesn't harm your essential being, it doesn't harm your character. But pain itself is, in a sense, like, harmless, and it's important to view it as indifferent. It's just an unpleasant sensation. I say that because we instinctively view pain as a sign of harm, and so that's one of the things I really feel, if we really get into the subjective side of what's going on when people cope with pain, a big part of it is their ability to say, look, even though this hurts, it's kind of what I call empty pain or meaningless pain. Like if you're having dentistry or surgery or whatever, you think, yeah, this hurts, but I know that it's not actually hurting me, it's not injuring me, so I kind of need to not view it as threatening. But most people I think at some level instinctively view pain as threatening, and then that means they pay more attention to it, they put it under a magnifying glass, they intensify their reaction to it, and so the pain becomes more painful as a consequence of that. So learning to see chronic pain or other types of pain as non-threatening is important, on the assumption again that they actually are non-threatening. The idea here isn't that somebody has a genuine pain and they need to go and consult the doctor about and they're just ignoring it. Rather it's that they have a pain that they know deserves to be ignored, like, because it's a chronic pain that's not symptomatic of a problem that requires attention. And the other thing that Ignat said was useful was kind of viewing pain from an outside point of view. I guess in modern therapy jargon, we would definitely tend to say that, describe that as not being fused with the pain, like gaining distance from it, not being fused with it, like viewing it as something kind of over there, rather than just being kind of lost in it, identifying with it, whatever, however you want to phrase it. John said he hasn't tried this exercise yet, I think, but it sounded like maybe he hasn't tried the one in this course, but has tried the other one. He's committed to doing this stuff though, and has noticed a world of difference in daily routine. So there's another example of someone that's doing stuff and getting benefit, and I know that the rest of you will read that and be inspired by it to try more with the techniques yourself. Less bothered about pain. He's been reading Karen Duffy's book, or Duff's book, which I reviewed and did a video review of. I would recommend. Also because it's very different from most of the books about Stoicism, right? Duff was a TV presenter and, has a much more kind of, how would you put it, informal, like humorous style of writing. So, for a lot of people, that's going to be much more accessible than a lot of the books on Stoicism. But there's I think a chapter on Stoicism in it, where she talks about how she discovered Stoicism and immediately related to it. It resonated with her in terms of the view of pain that she'd developed having suffered from chronic pain. And her book is called Backbone. I always get the subtitle wrong. It's something like How to Live with Chronic Pain Without Becoming One, I think, or words to that effect. It's called Backbone though. Kevin has sounds like some sort of slip disc. Getting benefits by combining Stoicism with meditation. Yeah. John said he was reassured by it, that the stuff works. Yeah, again, like this effect of really important. Like, I almost feel like pain management and therapy should only be done in groups, because when you have individual clients, you teach them these techniques and you tell them the research, and they're just like, more than for any other problem, maybe I don't know, maybe depression's kind of like that as well. But in pain, the clients are often like, well, I didn't really do the homework, kind of thing. I didn't do the techniques because I wasn't really sure if they would help me or whatever. Then you do it in a group and one person's like, oh yeah, this is awesome, like it's transformed my life, and the next week everyone else is doing it, right? It's like nobody listens to the therapist. Like, but, like, what would you know? Like, but yeah, and quite rightly, nobody listens to experts. It's one of the things that psychology kind of like tells us, that there's of course people listen to experts in a way, but they are less persuaded by experts because they kind of assume they're biased, and people are much more persuaded by kind of peer testimonials, like by other ordinary people with similar problems, telling them like sincerely that they're benefiting. And that's more obvious in treating pain than any other psychological therapy that I can think of. That's why I'm stressing it when we're talking about it now. It's not something the Stoics really touch on that much, though. Although they talk a lot about role modelling and stuff, I guess. That's a similar kind of idea. They don't really talk about people doing stuff in groups, though. So, okay, Philip found the exercise helpful, the audio exercise, I guess, maybe, or just maybe the techniques in general. He says it's all about getting the ruling faculty to a point where it's not compelled or kind of enslaved by sensations. Yeah, like, that sounds very much like something Marcus Aurelius would have said. Like, Epictetus, it's all about, liberating your ruling faculty. By the way, let me just kind of stress a paradox. Weirdly, when you finish doing something, I wrote this blinking book and I've edited it to death and read it to death, and now it's in print, and I realised I didn't explain what the title means. Like, there's one or two things I left out of it that I would, maybe for a second edition I'll put in. And one of them is I didn't really explain properly what the title kind of implies. One of the central paradoxes of this whole Cynic Stoic tradition that goes all the way back to Socrates is this idea that philosophers can be kingly, even though living in poverty, and that someone who's a king, like a tyrant, could be slavish, even though they're very wealthy and powerful. And so this is what's called a paradox in philosophy. It seems contrary to popular opinion. It's like the opposite. And it's at the root of that famous anecdote about Diogenes the Cynic, being able to speak to Alexander the Great on an equal footing. This kind of idea. So the idea how to think like a Roman emperor, what I have in my mind when I say that is that the Stoics thought Diogenes was like a king or an emperor, and that to be truly kingly, they would go further and to say that the real meaning of being a king or an emperor, you might say, is to have a kind of regal mindset, like where you liberate your own mind from slavery, and that's what it really means. That's what it means in this kind of paradoxical philosophical sense. Like, to be a king is to have liberated yourself deep within your own mind. So I think that's kind of important. In that sense, we can all be emperors. Like, they would have said Diogenes was a king, like, though he didn't own anything. Like, he was a king in his mind, because he freed himself, he ruled over pain and so on. So it's about getting the ruling faculty. Even the word ruling faculty, hegemonikon in Greek, which is kind of our conscious mind, basically, or reason, is a play on words, right? Because it's the part of our mind that the Stoics think should be like a king, a ruler, but it's typically, they think of it as being typically usurped and enslaved by the passions, and so we have to restore it to its rightful role as being like the top of the hierarchy and kind of like determining things like a king, like setting our ruling faculty on its throne, as it were, and putting it in its rightful place in charge of everything, not enslaved by the passions and sensations. Michael said he's happy to say he sees pains as more indifferent now, and he's going to stop whinging. Yeah, like, this is like a kind of big theme. I wouldn't give that advice to people out of context or cold, though, because it sounds a bit harsh, but that is kind of like where the Stoics are heading with this. In the what next section, you guys, you folks wrote a lot. Ignat wrote, although you are all male actually that have commented this time. Ignat said, enjoyed the week. As a nurse, not sure it'd be easy to teach methods to patients. Well, I'm going to not disagree with you, but I'm going to question that, because I think the crash course provides evidence that people who are unfamiliar with Stoicism will find these approaches accessible if they're presented. Now, that was the main thing I wanted to test, actually. I mean, we can't really properly test efficacy at this point. We can only get sort of hints at that. But what I really wanted to test in the beta testing was like usability and whether people would find the approach appealing. So we got a lot of people who are new to the subject doing it, and they were largely fine with it. And they, again, once they also saw feedback from other people participating, that motivated them. So yeah, I think actually we have a packaged version of Stoicism, or we're approaching that could be used with hospital patients, people who suffer from chronic pain who have never read Marcus Aurelius or whatever. John said he found it useful, lots to practice and think about, as always. Saw Stoicism in a brand new light because it had immediate effects, and pain management techniques could also be used more generally for other parts of life. Marcus actually says that at one point, so yeah, I agree with that, totally. Michael really enjoyed this week. We'll revisit the course, enjoyed the comments. Again, this kind of like learning from your peers, social learning we also call that. Listen to my book. So he's not sure he's as much like Lucius Verus now. Yeah, I mean, again, like, you'll notice in the Roman histories, people are either kind of idealised or demonised, right? And most of those histories are written by politicians, mainly senators. And so, like, maybe the author of the Historia Augusta, the authors that they're drawing on. Historia Augusta is one of our main sources, but it's like a kind of like third-hand version of things, because it was written in the 3rd, 4th century AD, based on texts that were in circulation, which are some of which are lost now. And then we have Herodian and we have Cassius Dio, who lived during the reign of Commodus, basically, and Cassius Dio was a senator, and we don't know what Herodian was, but he sounds like maybe some kind of more minor, like, government official or whatever. But they maybe have agendas, right? So, like, it would be like a senator or like a civil servant a generation later writing the about President Obama or President Trump or whatever. Like, we're maybe getting a biased version of things. Looks like we probably are, right? But then there are some things. There's things that kind of suggest there's some truth in it or corroborate it. The most I think we can say is, look, these are the stories, and sometimes the stories are told fairly consistently, sometimes they aren't. But anyway, about the book, not so sure he's like Lucius Verus, at least the way he's portrayed. It's convenient anyway that we have these two brothers and they're portrayed as opposites, because like it lends itself to a story. So yeah, historical accuracy, I have to attach a caveat to that. I feel like Lucius Verus is maybe getting an unfair deal out of this, perhaps, but who knows. I mean, the only thing I'd say then is, well, we're told all these stories, but then we have we have these different sorts of evidence. So we have the evidence from Marcus's letters. It doesn't really, I don't think it mentions Lucius in the letters. It doesn't, or certainly he doesn't say very much about him. In the meditations he talks about him. But then, what sort of evidence do we have from the meditations? So this is now his private reflections. It's not like a generation later being written by a politician. But nevertheless, in the meditations, he doesn't damn Lucius, but he kind of doesn't have anything positive really to say about him. He says he's affectionate and loyal. Other than that, he doesn't seem to particularly admire him. So that kind of, if you read that as kind of damning him with faint praise, then arguably it's consistent with what we hear in the Historia Augusta, like a couple of centuries later. I can imagine that the guy that's described there, who seems like a kind of reckless playboy alcoholic type, could be the same guy that Marcus is, struggling to find anything positive to say about, except that he was an affectionate brother. And I should say that one of the historians, I can't remember which one it is now, I think it might be the Historia Augusta as well, says that Marcus viewed, we always, it kind of bugs me a little bit that we always refer to Lucius Verus as Marcus's brother, because he was also his son-in-law, sorry, he was his son-in-law. He married Marcus's daughter. So these relationships among Roman nobles can require a diagram. Sometimes they get convoluted. So, and Lucius was 9 years younger than Marcus. So therefore, one of the histories says that Marcus very much viewed him more like he was a son. He was his adoptive brother who married his daughter, and was nearly a decade younger than him. So yeah, that kind of makes sense that he would have actually viewed him as like a son. And people talk about Commodus succeeding Marcus, but no one ever mentions the fact that when Marcus was acclaimed emperor, it sounds like he's setting up Lucius Verus to be his successor, who would also have been a terrible choice. But he sounds like, because Lucius is younger and fitter and healthier, we'd assume that they would have expected him to outlive Marcus and therefore to have been Marcus's successor, probably, although to everyone's surprise he dropped dead. So anyway, Stefan says there's lots of good strategies for pain. Takes time to digest, as always. And he's also reading about metacognitive therapy, and he finds it fits in well with Stoicism. Yeah, I think that. I mean, I think it's tricky. Metacognitive therapy is a tricky thing to combine with other things. It's one of my favourite approaches to therapy. I did some training. I did a workshop with Adrian Wells, who's the guy that developed metacognitive therapy at the University of Manchester. He's one of the leading researchers on cognitive therapy. And absolutely 100% behind metacognitive therapy as a cutting-edge, evidence-based approach to... for people who kind of like, psychotherapy, schmicotherapy, it's like, like metacognitive therapy is a cutting-edge, thoroughly research-based, rigorously research-based, highly effective like psychotherapy. It's not widely practiced even like now. It's been around a little while longer now, but it's becoming like more common. But there is scientific progress in the field of psychotherapy, and so the way people talk about psychotherapy, it's kind of like as if things don't move on. Well, they do. It's research driven. And so to be talking about Freud or Jung or whatever in this day and age is crazy, when in context anyway, when we should be talking about evidence-based interventions that people have spent decades developing, doing study after study. It's not a free-for-all. There's science going on here. Philip says struggles with the notion of piety. We're off from pain now a little bit. How it fits in with modern sensibilities, wants to know more. That was a long discussion. I didn't really get to the end of it, so I'm not entirely sure where that discussion was going. But I guess the thing that first popped into my mind when I started reading that was that what's worth throwing into the mix anyway is that Einstein was a fan of Spinoza, who doesn't really mention the Stoics, or I think he mentions them in passing and not necessarily favourably. But some people have said, look, Spinoza looks more Stoic than the Stoics. He looks like he's pretty heavily influenced by Stoicism. And he certainly ended up saying something that's very similar to Stoicism. So Einstein was into a philosophy that resembled Stoicism, particularly in respect of its pantheism. And so Einstein's God is this kind of impersonal God of science, if you like, that it's the kind of, and I think you'll allude to this, a contrast between religious piety and piety towards nature. That like the Stoic God is this ambiguous God who's pantheistic. It's nature, and it is a more providential theological conception of nature, which is the hard part. It's tricky because to a modern mind, there are some subtleties to that are just lost to most modern readers, because we have such a very different mindset in this respect. But I think it's helpful to think of Einstein as an example of a scientist who shared a similar spiritual perspective to the Stoics like that. And also I wanted to mention, the other thing that's useful to mention here is that the early Christians and I think the Neoplatonists as well, thought that the Stoics were virtually atheists, because I think one of the the Neoplatonists, maybe Plotinus, says, or Plotinus, says that the Stoics only really introduced God in name only, like Zeus in name only, and it's not a real conception of God. If you equate God with nature, then you're just playing lip service to the concept of God. He's not transcendent or whatever, or kind of like metaphysical anymore. I mean, Epictetus certainly seems pretty like religious minded, but he's talking about the whole of nature. So that even in their day, the Stoics were viewed as kind of ambiguous in this regard. Like some people pegged them as atheists, surprisingly, because they were like not willing to believe in a transcendent metaphysical, version of God, and they kind of make God a bit more impersonal in some ways. Or they give him a personality, but they view it as a kind of metaphor for nature, which clearly in some regards they view as impersonal. So, make of that what you will. It's a little bit more complex and ambiguous than people might initially assume. And I'll just tell you a couple of other little things that are worth throwing into that mix. So we know that in Zeno's Republic he said there wouldn't be any temples in the ideal republic. And then centuries later, in Lucan's Pharsalia, this epic poem that we have, which is about the Roman Civil War, and Lucan was a Stoic, he was the nephew of Seneca, and he paints a picture of Cato of Utica as this kind of Stoic Superman, this great Roman hero, almost superhuman. And there's a famous passage, I'll digress slightly just to tell you this story because it's so cool. So Cato is gathering together the remnants of the shattered Republican army, and he's marching them across the deserts of Africa on this kind of suicide mission. They're going to make their last stand at this fortified town in North Africa called Utica, and they're going to fight Caesar in the Civil War, because Cato's insisting that Caesar is a wannabe dictator, which he was right about all along. And they know they're going to lose, basically. But Cato gives them this rousing speech in the poem, at least in the Pharsalia. And he basically says, look, it doesn't matter whether we win or lose, we still have to fight, because we're fighting them is the right thing to do. We're making a moral stand here, to defend the republic, to defend freedom against a dictatorship. And we might die in the process, but that shouldn't influence our decision. We need to stand up for what we believe in. So this incredible hardcore principled stance is what's virtually Cato's name became synonymous with adopting this hard moral line. And they stumble across a shrine to the god Ammon, who is equated with Zeus or Jupiter in the desert. And so the legionaries would naturally have expected Cato, who's effectively their general, to consult the shrine and get a prophecy about what was going to happen in the forthcoming battle. And one of the officers in particular is trying to get him to do that. And Cato, the Stoic, says no. And then he launches into this speech where he's presented as almost a divine, like a prophet or something. But paradoxically, he's giving this kind of impassioned speech, becoming this prophetic, mystical figure, while explaining why he's not going to set foot in a temple. And this harks back to Zeno saying there wouldn't be any temples in the Republic. And part of what he says is that Jupiter is everywhere. He wouldn't be submerged in the desert in this little building. That's ridiculous. And he, what he's implicitly doing is condemning organised religion, and this idea that you would go and seek advice from a priest and stuff like that. And he's saying, Zeus, Jupiter, is everywhere in the sky and the earth. He says, I don't need to go in this place. And he goes, I don't need to get a prophecy from him either, because he's already told me everything that he needs to tell me is already planted within me. I just need to look within myself, to find guidance from him, is what he says. So again, this kind of challenging of traditional organised religion from the Stoics, but nevertheless a kind of religious attitude, kind of ambiguous. Okay, so moving on to looking at what's in week 4. So it's about loss and death, which I always thought was people might be a bit freaked out by, but everyone seems to really enjoy talking about death, so, that's okay. There's a video about lost death and the view from above. Then the excerpt is this passage about how the soul injures itself. It's one of my favourite passages in the Meditations. So Marcus says there are 5 ways the soul injures itself. It's worth remembering these. Number 1, when it resents events that befall it. It's the opposite of amor fati. It's not loving its fate, it's resenting its fate. Number 2, when it wants to harm another person through hate or anger. Number 3, when it's thrown off course by pain or pleasure. Number 4, when it's phony or insincere. And number 5, when it lives aimlessly without having a fundamental goal, without the goal of life, the pursuit of eudaimonia. And then there are some stories about Marcus and his experience of bereavement and so on, how he coped with that. Then there's an audio recording about Marcus contemplating the Danube. I shot some videos at the Danube actually when I was there, so this is very kind of resonant for me because I was just at that location. There's a whole bunch of passages where Marcus refers to this metaphor of time as a river, which is inherited from Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic philosopher. And the Romans even personified the Danube as a river god. It's on the Aurelian column. So this was a big deal to Marcus. The river dominated his life, and he was stationed along it for the best part of a decade, fighting the first and second Marcomannic wars. And so I think in these passages it's nice to put them in a context and relate them to his environment. So we can think that he's referring to the Danube, or at least he has the Danube in some sense in mind, which is just virtually outside his window when he's writing all these passages about the symbolism of time as a river. And then there's a section about how Marcus contemplated loss and mortality, the transience of all things, that change is natural and indifferent, that we should always remember that we're dying, and how death itself is indifferent, all the many different arguments that the Stoics forward for the indifference of death. And then there's some audio about the view from above in Stoicism. We can distinguish between the Olympian view, like the gods looking down from Olympus, or what I call the cosmological view, when we think of the universe and the whole of space and time. Then there are excerpts from Justius Lipsius and Antony, the third Earl of Shaftesbury. I wanted to throw that in at the end because they both happen to have particularly beautiful passages, early modern passages about the view from above, early modern Stoics, or like kind of neo-Stoics, and also just to introduce you to this wider literature that it's not just Marcus Aurelius. The Earl of Shaftesbury in particular, if you love Marcus Aurelius' Meditations, you should definitely read the Philosophical Regimen. It's basically the same thing, but an early modern version of it, and it doubles as an amazing commentary on Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. It's a great book if you're into the Meditations. If someone told me they really liked the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, I would say that should be the next book that they should read, definitely. If they really love the Meditations, it's basically an early modern version of the Meditations. Then the audio exercise of the view from above, I re-recorded it for this course. It's one of the most popular recordings. I've done a lot of recordings over the years of meditation exercises and stuff, and this is probably the most popular one, so definitely worth doing. Then discussing strategies about coming to terms with mortality, what are the pros and cons of focusing on the transience of things and accepting your own mortality. In a way, it's a loaded question because are there any disadvantages to it or are there any disadvantages that we can't work around anyway? But I think it's very important to get people to pose that question in that way and to kind of evaluate what they're doing, because it helps them to troubleshoot and get more out of the exercises. And then the bonus section is this chapter on the Civil War with Avidius Cassius that was part of my book proposal originally. I guess all that I'll say about that is if you're interested in reading it, I think it's one of the periods in the histories where we most clearly see an example of Marcus acting in accord with his Stoic principles. And actually you could say, and maybe it's no surprise, that if you look at the account of Marcus's life and reign in the Roman histories, as he gets older he seems to get more Stoic. He studied Stoicism from an early age, maybe age 12, even as early as 12, which was exceptional at that time. But as he gets older, he's portrayed increasingly as a sage-like, Stoic figure. And this, in 175 AD, like 5 years before he died, the way that he responded to the civil war in Cassius Dio is, without mentioning Stoicism really, it's obvious. There are bits of it that sound unstoic, but there are also obvious striking things about it that sound particularly like something a Stoic would have done. Odd, surprising, paradoxical things that the Stoicism would have led someone to do. There are a couple of things, but one of them is the most obvious thing is that when he learns about the Civil War, the first thing that he offers to do is to pardon everybody involved, which ironically led to the whole thing being ending. He that was what helped him to win the Civil War, basically, the fact that he offered to pardon, because then the legionaries didn't have a reason to fight him anymore. So you could say it was, maybe there was some cunning involved in that. But that's Fronto at one point early on says to Marcus that he's worried that all this Stoicism is going to lead him to do kind of crazy things as emperor, that he's going to make crazy decisions as emperor because he's too influenced by these way out ideas like being bounced around by wacko philosophers. And that's all one thing, it's all good, it's all fun and games in the lecture theatre, but when you're actually in power, you can't go around following that sort of not very worldly advice that they give. And here we have an example of Marcus actually doing something that sounds paradoxical and crazy and inspired by Stoicism, and it actually works in his favour. So we can imagine it would have surprised a lot of people. It's the kind of the opposite of the response that the Senate gave, who heard about the Civil War before the news reached Marcus. Okay, so that is everything, and I hope that you've enjoyed the whole course. I will go on and do an Ask Me Anything on the How to Think Like a Roman Emperor Facebook group, so I might see some of you there. And as always, feel free to email me or message me if you've got any questions, you want to get in touch for any reason. So good luck with the rest of the course, and do stay in touch. And also I'll look forward maybe to seeing some of you at Stoicon in Athens if you're thinking of coming along to that. So goodbye from me once again here in Athens. Bye.